The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Deadwood, Dakota Territory, as if the very earth knew what darkness would unfold that day. September 15th, 1876, marked another routine auction day in the rapidly growing frontier town, where desperate souls and opportunistic buyers gathered to exchange lives for coin. Bridget O'Sullivan stood trembling behind the makeshift wooden platform, her emerald eyes scanning the crowd of rough-looking men who had gathered for the morning's proceedings. The 22-year-old woman's red hair, once carefully braided by her mother's loving hands, now hung in tangled strands around her pale face. Her simple brown dress, torn and stained from weeks of travel and mistreatment, barely protected her from the cold morning air that swept down from the Black Hills. "Next lot," bellowed Silas Hawthorne, the auctioneer, whose gravelly voice carried the weight of 1,000 such transactions. His weathered hands gestured toward Bridget with the casual indifference of a man selling livestock. Young Irish woman, strong back, good for housework or other domestic duties. The crowd of men pressed closer, their eyes evaluating her with the cold calculation of buyers examining merchandise. Bridget's heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered her father's words before the fever took him. "Stay strong, my darling girl. No matter what happens, remember you're an O'Sullivan. We don't break." Among the sea of faces, she noticed the usual suspects of frontier society: ranch owners seeking cheap labor, saloon keepers looking for serving girls, and worse, men whose intentions she dared not contemplate. The stench of unwashed bodies, tobacco and whiskey filled her nostrils as the crowd grew more animated. "What's her story, Hawthorne?" called out Jake Morrison, a cattle rancher known for his harsh treatment of workers. His thick mustache twitched as he adjusted his worn hat. "She got papers?" "Indentured contract, 7 years, Hawthorne replied, waving a crumpled document. "Family died of fever crossing the Missouri. She's healthy, no diseases, and she's got some learning. Can read and write." Bridget closed her eyes, fighting back tears as she remembered the horrible journey that had brought her here. Her parents, Michael and Mary O'Sullivan, had sold everything they owned in County Cork to bring their family to America, seeking the promise of land and opportunity. Instead, they found death on the trail, leaving her alone and vulnerable to the unscrupulous men who preyed on desperate immigrants. "I'll start the bidding at $50, Hawthorne announced, his voice cutting through her painful memories. "50, came a voice from the back. "60, another man called out. As the bidding continued, Bridget felt her world spinning. She had watched this same scene play out with other unfortunates over the past 3 days, waiting for her turn on the block. Some were sold to work claims in the gold fields, others to serve in the growing network of businesses that fed off the mining boom. None of the outcomes looked promising for a young woman alone in the world. $100, Morrison's voice boomed over the crowd. Several men turned to look at him, recognizing the seriousness of his bid. Morrison owned one of the largest ranches in the territory, and his reputation for working his hands to death was well known. Bridget's knees nearly buckled. She had heard whispered stories about Morrison's ranch, how workers disappeared into the vast Dakota landscape, never to be seen again. The thought of spending 7 years under his control filled her with a terror that made her previous hardships seem manageable. "100, going once," Hawthorne called out, his hammer raised. That's when she saw him. Standing at the edge of the crowd, partially hidden by the shadow of the general store, was a man unlike any she had seen before. Tall and lean, with long black hair that caught the morning light, he wore a mixture of traditional Native American clothing and settlers' garments. His buckskin shirt was decorated with intricate beadwork, while his legs were covered in worn denim pants and leather boots. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, dark and intense, yet filled with something she hadn't seen in weeks: compassion. "Going twice," Hawthorne continued, seemingly oblivious to the figure in the shadows. The man stepped forward, his movements fluid and purposeful. As he emerged from the shadows, Bridget could see the strong lines of his face, the high cheekbones and bronze skin that spoke of Lakota heritage. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and she heard murmurs of recognition. "That's Dakota," someone whispered. "Crazy Horse's cousin." "What's he doing here?" another voice hissed. Dakota raised his hand, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd. $200. The marketplace erupted in shocked murmurs. Morrison's face reddened as he turned to face this unexpected challenger. "You got that kind of money, savage?" Dakota reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a handful of gold coins, letting them catch the sunlight. "I have it." Hawthorne's eyes widened at the sight of the gold. In a territory where most transactions were conducted in promises and credit, hard currency was a rarity. $200 from the gentleman, do I hear $250? Morrison's jaw worked furiously as he considered his options. $200 was already more than most workers would earn in a year. To go higher would be throwing money away on principal alone. $250, he growled. $300, Dakota replied immediately, his voice calm and steady. The crowd fell silent. Even by frontier standards, $300 was an enormous sum for an indentured servant. Morrison's face cycled through various shades of red and purple as he struggled with his decision. $300, Hawthorne repeated, his voice betraying his excitement at the unexpected windfall. Do I hear $350? Morrison looked around the crowd, seeking support, but found only curious stares. Finally, he spat into the dust and stalked away, muttering curses under his breath. $300. Going once, going twice. Hawthorne's hammer came down with a sharp crack. Sold to the gentleman for $300. As the crowd began to disperse, Bridget found herself staring at the man who had just purchased her contract. Dakota approached the platform with the same fluid grace she had noticed earlier, his expression unreadable. Papers, he said simply to Hawthorne, who quickly produced the necessary documents. While the two men completed their transaction, Bridget studied her new owner. The word stuck in her throat. Despite his intervention, she was still bound to 7 years of servitude, still property to be bought and sold. Yet something in his manner suggested this arrangement might be different from what she had feared. Come, Dakota said, turning to her after completing his business with Hawthorne. His English was clear but accented, each word carefully chosen. We go now. Bridget climbed down from the platform on unsteady legs, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask. As they walked through the dusty streets of Deadwood, she noticed how people stared at them, the Lakota warrior and the Irish woman, an unlikely pair that challenged the rigid social boundaries of frontier society. Where are we going? She finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Dakota glanced at her, and she thought she saw the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Away from here, away from men like Morrison who see people as cattle to be owned. But you bought me. You own my contract. They had reached the edge of town, where a beautiful paint horse waited patiently tied to a hitching post. Dakota untied the reins and turned to face her fully for the first time. I bought your contract, yes, but I do not own you. No man owns another person. This is something my people have always known, something your people seem to have forgotten. His words sent a shock through her system. I don't understand. You will, he said, offering her his hand to help her mount the horse. My grandmother once told me that the spirits sometimes put us in places where we can help others find their path. Perhaps this is such a time. As they rode away from Deadwood, Bridget felt the first stirring of hope she had experienced in months. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, and for the first time since her parents' death, she dared to believe that her future might hold something other than suffering. Behind them, the frontier town continued its daily business, unaware that a simple auction had set in motion events that would challenge everything both the white settlers and the Lakota people believed about each other, about survival, and about the power of human compassion in the face of an unforgiving world. The sun climbed higher in the Dakota sky, casting new shadows across the land as Bridget O'Sullivan began the next chapter of her life, riding toward an uncertain but no longer hopeless future. The rhythmic sound of the paint horse's hooves against the packed earth was the only conversation between Bridget and Dakota as they rode deeper into the Dakota territory. The sun had climbed to its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the rolling hills that stretched endlessly in every direction. For 2 hours they had traveled in silence, leaving the dust and chaos of Deadwood far behind. Bridget clung to the horse's mane, her body aching from the unfamiliar position. She had never ridden a horse before coming to America, and the constant motion was making her stomach churn. More than the physical discomfort, however, was the uncertainty gnawing at her mind. Where was this man taking her? What did he mean when he said he didn't own her? Nothing in her experience had prepared her for such a concept. We stop here, Dakota said suddenly, guiding the horse toward a small creek that wound through a grove of cottonwood trees. The sound of running water was a welcome relief from the oppressive silence. Bridget slid down from the horse with far less grace than she would have liked, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Dakota dismounted with fluid ease, immediately tending to the horse's needs before his own. She watched him work, noting the gentle way he spoke to the animal in what she assumed was his native language. "You should drink," he said, nodding toward the creek. "And wash if you wish. The water is clean here." For the first time in weeks, Bridget felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. The simple kindness of his suggestion, treating her like a human being rather than property, was almost overwhelming. She knelt by the water's edge, cupping the cool liquid in her hands and drinking deeply before splashing her face and neck. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if he could hear her. "You do not need to thank me for treating you as a person should be treated," Lakota replied, settling against a large rock near the water. "Tell me, what is your name? Your real name, not what that man called you." "Bridget O'Sullivan," she said, sitting on a fallen log a respectful distance away. "My father was Michael O'Sullivan, and my mother was Mary Flanagan before she married. We came from County Cork." Lakota nodded slowly. "I am Lakota, son of Chayton, grandson of Ayana. My white name is Thomas, given to me at the mission school, but I prefer the name my grandmother chose for me." "What does it mean?" "Lakota, friend to everyone," he said, a slight smile playing at his lips. "My grandmother had high hopes for me, I think." Bridget found herself studying his face more closely. There was something in his expression that spoke of deep sadness, of experiences that had aged him beyond his years. "How do you speak English so well?" The smile faded from Lakota's face. "I spent 5 years at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. They have a saying there, 'Kill the Indian, save the man.' They cut my hair, forbade me to speak my language, and tried to make me forget who I was." He touched his chest, where she could see the edge of what looked like a scar beneath his shirt. "But some things cannot be killed, no matter how hard they try." "I'm sorry," Bridget said softly. "That sounds terrible." "It was necessary," he replied with a shrug. "To survive in your world, I needed to understand it, but I learned that understanding does not mean accepting." He looked at her directly. "What happened to your family?" The question she had been dreading. Bridget wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the familiar ache of loss settle in her chest. "Fever took them on the trail. We were 3 days out from Fort Laramie when it started. First my little brother Sean, then my father, then my mother. I buried them myself." "You have no other family?" "None that I know of. My parents left everything behind in Ireland. There was supposed to be a cousin in California, but..." She shrugged helplessly. "I don't even know his name." Lakota was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the rocks. "The fever that took your family. It has been killing many people on the trails. White doctors call it typhoid. It spreads quickly in the crowded conditions of the wagon trains." "You sound like you know something about medicine." "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me about plants and herbs before I was sent away. When I returned from the school, I found she had been caring for both our people and some of the settlers who were willing to accept her help." His voice hardened slightly. "She died last winter. The reservation doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think she died of a broken heart." Bridget heard the pain in his voice and felt an unexpected kinship with this man who had lost so much. "I'm sorry for your loss." "She would have liked you," Lakota said unexpectedly. "She always said that suffering could either make a person bitter or make them wise. You have sadness in your eyes, but not bitterness." The compliment caught Bridget off guard. "I don't feel very wise, I feel lost." "That is the beginning of wisdom," he replied, "knowing that you do not know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek and the wind in the cottonwood leaves. Finally, Bridget gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since they left Deadwood. "What happens now? Where are we going?" Lakota stood and walked to his horse, retrieving a leather bag from the saddle. He pulled out strips of dried meat and what looked like a kind of bread, offering half to Bridget. "We go to my cabin. It is about 2 hours from here in the hills. You will be safe there while we decide what to do about your situation." "My situation?" "Your indenture contract. It is legal by white man's law, but it is wrong. No person should be owned by another. Not for 7 years, not for 7 minutes." He bit into the dried meat, chewing thoughtfully. "I have some ideas, but they will take time to arrange." Bridget accepted the food gratefully, surprised by how hungry she was. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Lakota said. "I know you were afraid but not broken. I know you have lost everything but still have hope in your eyes, and I know what it feels like to be treated as less than human. But $300, that's more money than I've ever seen in my life. It is gold I found in the streams near my cabin. The earth gives freely to those who know how to ask." He looked at her seriously. "But even if it had been my last dollar, it would have been worth it to keep you away from men like Morrison." "What do you know about Morrison?" Lakota's expression darkened. "He has had 3 indentured servants in the past 2 years, 2 men and a woman. The men were found dead in the wilderness, supposedly killed by Indians. The woman simply disappeared. Morrison claimed she ran away, but he shook his head. My people did not kill those men, and that woman did not run away. A chill ran down Bridget's spine as she realized how close she had come to a terrible fate. You saved my life, perhaps, or perhaps you saved mine. At her puzzled expression, he continued, Since my grandmother died, I have been living between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. Helping you gives me purpose again. After they finished eating, they continued their journey through the increasingly rugged landscape. The hills grew steeper, covered with pine and oak trees that provided welcome shade from the afternoon sun. Bridget noticed how Lakota seemed to know every trail, every landmark, moving through the terrain with the confidence of someone who had grown up in these lands. Are we on the reservation? She asked as they climbed a particularly steep hill. No, this is unclaimed land technically. The government has not yet decided what to do with it. There was bitterness in his voice. They will, of course. They always do. What will happen to your people? What has already happened to most of them? We will be moved to smaller and smaller pieces of land until there is nothing left but memories. He guided the horse around a large boulder. But not all memories can be taken. Some live in the heart, in the blood, in the stories passed down from grandmother to grandchild. As they crested the hill, Bridget saw their destination, a small log cabin nestled in a sheltered valley, with smoke rising from its chimney. It was simple but well built, with a small corral containing 2 horses and a garden plot that showed signs of careful tending. Home, Lakota said simply. As they approached the cabin, Bridget noticed details that spoke of the care with which it had been built. The logs were perfectly fitted, the roof showed no signs of leaks, and the surrounding area was clean and organized. It was clear that this was not just a shelter, but a home created with love and attention. It's beautiful, she said, meaning it. My grandmother helped me build it when I returned from the school. She said a man needs a place where he can remember who he is. He dismounted and helped her down. You are welcome here for as long as you need. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, looking out at the vast Lakota landscape, Bridget felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the deeper hope of possibility. Perhaps in this place between worlds, she could find a new path forward. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. But tonight, for the first time since her parents' death, Bridget O'Sullivan would sleep without fear. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's single window, casting geometric patterns across the rough-hewn wooden floor. Bridget stirred from the most peaceful sleep she had experienced in months, momentarily disoriented by the absence of fear that had become her constant companion. The simple bed Lakota had fashioned from pine logs and buffalo hide was more comfortable than the hard ground or vermin-infested boarding houses she had endured since her parents' death. She could hear movement outside, the sound of someone working with quiet efficiency. Through the window, she watched Lakota tending to a small fire near the cabin, preparing what appeared to be breakfast. He moved with the same fluid grace she had noticed the day before, each action purposeful and unhurried. The interior of the cabin told the story of a man caught between 2 worlds. Traditional Lakota items, beaded pouches, painted buffalo hide, a carved wooden flute, shared space with practical frontier necessities like iron tools, books, and a small writing desk. On the mantel above the stone fireplace sat a photograph of an elderly Lakota woman, her weathered face radiating wisdom and strength. Your grandmother? Bridget asked as she emerged from the cabin, smoothing her wrinkled dress. Lakota looked up from the fire, nodding. Ayana. She was 93 winters when she crossed to the spirit world. She lived through the time when the buffalo covered the plains like a brown sea, and she lived to see the last of them disappear. She looked strong. She was. Stronger than the soldiers who came to take us to the reservation. Stronger than the missionaries who said our beliefs were wrong. Stronger than the sickness that finally claimed her. He stirred something in a metal pot over the fire. She would have understood what you were going through. She often said that the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the choice to remain human when the world tries to make you into something else. Bridget accepted the bowl of stew he offered her, surprised by the rich flavors of meat and wild vegetables. This is delicious. What is it? Rabbit, wild onions, and prairie turnips, the same food my people have eaten for generations. He settled beside her on a log bench. I thought today we should talk about your future. The words sent a flutter of anxiety through her stomach. What do you mean? Your indenture contract. It is a legal document, but there may be ways to challenge it. I've been thinking about this since yesterday. He pulled out a folded paper from his shirt pocket. I went to the mission school, remember? I learned about your laws, your courts, your ways of doing things. Bridget set down her bowl, her appetite suddenly gone. But you paid $300 for it. That makes it legal, doesn't it? Legal and right are not always the same thing. Dakota's dark eyes were serious. The contract says you must work for 7 years to pay off a debt of $200, but the law also says that indentured servants must be treated fairly, given adequate food and shelter, and not subjected to abuse. And if they're not, then the contract can be voided. The servant can be freed. He paused, studying her face. But proving abuse is difficult, especially for a woman with no family, no money, and no connections. The reality of her situation settled over Bridget like a cold blanket. So I'm trapped. Not trapped, but the path to freedom is not simple. Dakota stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, looking out at the hills. There is another way, but it would require trust. Great trust. What do you mean? I could take you to California, help you find your cousin. Once you are out of the Dakota territory, the contract becomes much harder to enforce. He turned back to face her. But such a journey would be dangerous, for both of us. Bridget felt her heart racing. Dangerous how? A Lakota man traveling with a white woman would attract attention. There are many who would see us as unnatural, wrong. His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. And there are others who would see you as a runaway servant, and me as a thief. What would happen to us if we were caught? You would be returned to your contract holder. I would likely be hanged. The matter-of-fact way he said it made it even more chilling. But I think we could make it. I know the land, the safe places to stop, the people who might help us. The offer was generous beyond anything she had expected, but the risks were enormous. Why would you do this for me? Why would you risk your life? Dakota was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When I was at the Carlisle school, there was a boy named Joseph. He was Navajo, taken from his family when he was 7 years old. He used to cry at night for his mother, and the teachers would beat him for it. They said Indians don't cry, that we had to learn to be civilized. He paused, lost in the painful memory. One night, Joseph tried to run away. They caught him at the edge of town and brought him back. As punishment, they cut off all his hair and made him wear a dress to shame him. He was 12 years old. Bridget felt tears spring to her eyes. That's horrible. The next morning, Joseph was found dead in the dormitory. The teachers said his heart failed, but I knew better. His spirit had been broken and he chose to join his ancestors rather than live as something he was not. Dakota's voice was thick with emotion. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to help someone escape a cage, I would take it, even if it meant risking your own life. Especially then, a life lived in fear is not truly living. He looked at her directly. But the choice must be yours. I will not force you to run any more than I will force you to stay. Bridget stood and walked to the garden plot, where she could see the careful rows of vegetables Dakota had planted. The sight reminded her of her mother's garden back in Ireland, and the memory brought both pain and comfort. There's something else, isn't there? She said, turning back to him. Something you're not telling me. Dakota's expression grew troubled. Yesterday when we left Deadwood, I saw Morrison talking to Sheriff Hartley. They were watching us leave. What does that mean? It means they may come looking for us. Morrison is not the kind of man to let $300 walk away, especially when it was paid by an Indian. He joined her beside the garden. Hartley owes Morrison money, and he's not known for his fairness toward my people. A chill ran down Bridget's spine. How long do we have? Perhaps a day, perhaps a week. It depends on how badly Morrison wants to make a point. Dakota knelt and began pulling weeds from around a tomato plant. If we are going to leave, it should be soon. And if we stay, then we prepare for visitors, and hope that the law means more to them than their prejudices. Bridget sank onto the bench, overwhelmed by the weight of the decision before her. Either choice carried enormous risks, not just for her, but for this man who had already sacrificed so much to help her. I need to think, she said finally. Of course, but do not think too long. In my experience, the longer you wait to make a hard choice, the harder it becomes. They spent the rest of the morning in companionable silence, Dakota teaching her how to identify edible plants while she helped him tend the garden. His knowledge of the land was vast and deep, accumulated over years of living in harmony with the natural world. Your grandmother taught you all this? She asked as he showed her how to recognize wild mint. She taught me to see the land as a living thing, not just something to be owned and used up. He crushed a mint leaf between his fingers, releasing its fresh scent. She said the earth is our mother, and you do not sell your mother. Is that why you won't move to the reservation? The reservation is a cage with invisible bars. They give us just enough to survive, but not enough to live. His voice carried years of frustration. They want us to become farmers, to forget that we were once free to follow the buffalo across the plains. They want us to cut our hair, wear their clothes, and pretend that our ancestors never existed. But you learned their ways, you went to their school. I learned their ways so I could understand their weaknesses. Knowledge is power, and I needed power to survive. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. But learning their ways does not mean accepting their beliefs about who I should be. As the afternoon wore on, Bridget found herself studying Dakota's face, trying to understand the man who had risked everything to save her. There was strength in his features, but also kindness, intelligence, but also deep sadness. He was, she realized, the first person since her parents' death who had treated her as a human being rather than a burden or a commodity. "I've made my decision," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Dakota looked up from the leather harness he was mending. "Yes? I want to try for California. I want to find my cousin." She took a deep breath. "And I want you to come with me." A slow smile spread across his face. "Then we leave at dawn. Tonight, we prepare for the journey." As the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Bridget felt a mixture of fear and anticipation unlike anything she had ever experienced. Tomorrow would begin a journey that would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine, but for the first time since her parents' death, she was choosing her own path. Chapter 4. The Pursuit. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the cabin like a shroud, as Bridget and Dakota made their final preparations for the journey ahead. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of pine and the distant smell of wood smoke from some unseen campfire. Bridget's hands trembled slightly as she rolled her few belongings into the blanket Dakota had given her, more from anticipation than cold. "Remember," Dakota said quietly as he secured supplies to his horse, "if we are separated, head southwest toward the Platte River. Follow it until you reach Fort Kearney. Tell them you are a widow traveling to California to join family. Do not mention me or this place." "We won't be separated," Bridget replied with more confidence than she felt. "Perhaps not. But in the wilderness it is wise to prepare for all possibilities." He checked the rifle secured to his saddle, his movements efficient and practiced. "My grandmother used to say that hope for the best but prepare for the worst is the way of the wise." As they led the horses quietly away from the cabin, Bridget felt a pang of regret. In the short time she had been there, the small log structure had felt more like home than anywhere she had lived since leaving Ireland. The garden, the photographs, the carefully crafted furniture, all spoke of a life built with intention and care. "Will you ever come back?" she asked as they mounted up. "If the spirits will it," Dakota replied. "But a man must sometimes leave behind what he loves to protect what he values more." They rode in silence for the first hour, following a narrow trail that wound through dense forest. Dakota moved with the confidence of someone who knew every tree, every stream, every hiding place in these hills. The paint horse beneath Bridget seemed to sense the urgency of their journey, its hooves finding purchase on the rocky ground with sure-footed precision. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, they paused at a stream to water the horses and eat a quick breakfast of jerky and hardtack. The beauty of the landscape was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in oak and pine, meadows dotted with wildflowers, and always the vast sky that seemed to stretch on forever. "It's beautiful," Bridget said, watching a hawk circle high above them. "Yes, this land has been home to my people for more generations than can be counted." Dakota's voice carried both pride and sadness. "My great-grandfather used to hunt buffalo in these very hills. Now his great-grandson runs from white men's law through the same valleys." "I'm sorry," Bridget said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "You did not make this world, Bridget O'Sullivan. You are just trying to survive in it, same as me." He stood and walked to the edge of the stream, scanning the horizon. "But I think our past is about to catch up with us." "What do you mean?" "Dust, there to the east." He pointed toward a thin cloud rising above the tree line. "Riders, moving fast." Bridget's heart began to race. "How many?" "Hard to tell from here. At least 3, maybe more." He returned to the horses, his movements now urgent. "We need to move. Now." They rode hard for the next 2 hours, following trails that seemed to exist only in Dakota's memory. The landscape began to change as they traveled west, the dense forests giving way to more open country, dotted with rocky outcroppings and scattered groves of trees. Behind them, the dust cloud grew steadily larger. "Can we outrun them?" Bridget called out as they crested a small hill. "On this terrain, probably not, but we don't need to outrun them. We need to outsmart them." Dakota guided his horse toward a narrow canyon that cut through a ridge of red stone. This way. The canyon was barely wide enough for two horses to ride abreast, its walls rising 30 feet on either side. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the rock walls, creating an eerie symphony that made Bridget's skin crawl. She fought the urge to look back, knowing that seeing their pursuers would only make her more afraid. "There," Dakota said, pointing to a narrow opening in the canyon wall. "We go on foot from here." They dismounted and led the horses through the opening, which widened into a hidden valley perhaps 100 yards across. A small spring bubbled up from the rocks, creating a pool of crystal-clear water surrounded by grass and wildflowers. It was like a secret garden hidden in the heart of the stone. "How did you know this was here?" Bridget asked in amazement. "My grandfather showed it to me when I was a boy. He said it was a place where warriors could rest and think, protected by the spirits of the rocks." Dakota began unpacking supplies from his horse. "We will wait here until they pass." "What if they don't pass? What if they find us? Then we will deal with that when it happens." He handed her the rifle. "Do you know how to use this?" Bridget took the weapon with trembling hands. Her father had taught her to shoot rabbits back in Ireland, but she had never aimed a gun at another human being. "I've shot before, but point it at whatever you want to stop. Pull the trigger. The rifle will do the rest." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes were serious. "I pray you will not need to use it." They settled down to wait, the horses grazing peacefully in the hidden meadow, while their human companions listened for sounds of pursuit. The silence was broken only by the gentle bubbling of the spring and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they heard voices echoing through the canyon. Bridget's blood ran cold as she recognized the gravelly tone of Sheriff Hartley. "Tracks lead this way, Morrison. Can't be more than an hour ahead of us." "That savage thinks he's clever," came Morrison's reply, his voice thick with anger. "But there's nowhere to run out here. We'll have them by nightfall." "What exactly are we charging them with?" asked a third voice, younger and uncertain. "Theft of property," Morrison replied without hesitation. "That girl's got a legal contract and he took her without permission. That's stealing, plain and simple. And if they resist, then we do what needs to be done. Can't have Indians thinking they can take what belongs to white men." The voices faded as the riders passed through the canyon, but their words lingered in the air like smoke. Bridget felt sick to her stomach, realizing that these men saw her not as a person, but as property to be reclaimed. "They're gone," Dakota said after several minutes of silence, "but they'll be back. This canyon only leads to the Badlands, and when they realize we're not there, they'll backtrack. How long do we have? Perhaps 2 hours, maybe less if they're smarter than I think." He stood and began repacking their supplies. "We need to get to the river. If we can cross before they catch up, we'll have a chance." "What river?" "The Cheyenne. It's about 10 miles from here, but the trail is rough." He helped her onto her horse. "Once we cross, we'll be in different country. They may not follow. And if they do, then we keep running." They left the hidden valley by a different route, following a trail that wound through broken country, filled with gullies and scattered boulders. The going was slower now, the horses picking their way carefully over loose rock and around obstacles. Behind them, the dust cloud appeared again, closer now. "They're gaining on us," Bridget said, looking back over her shoulder. "I know." Dakota's jaw was set with determination. "But we're almost there. See that line of trees? That's the river." The sound of rushing water reached them before they could see it. The Cheyenne River, swollen with recent rains and moving fast. The crossing looked treacherous with swift current and hidden rocks waiting to trap the unwary. "Can we make it across?" Bridget asked, eyeing the churning water. "We have to." Dakota dismounted and began checking his horse's gear. "The current is strong, but the horses are good swimmers. Hold tight to the saddle horn and don't let go, no matter what happens." As they prepared to enter the water, the sound of pursuing horses grew louder. Through the trees, Bridget could see riders approaching, 5 men on horseback led by the unmistakable figure of Morrison on his big black gelding. "There they are," Morrison's voice carried across the water. "You're trapped now, savage." "Go!" Dakota shouted, spurring his horse into the river. The cold water hit Bridget like a physical blow, soaking through her clothes and shocking her system. The horse beneath her struggled against the current, fighting to keep its head above water as the river tried to sweep them downstream. Beside her, Dakota urged his mount forward, his voice calm and encouraging despite the chaos around them. Behind them, she could hear Morrison shouting orders to his men, but the sound was muffled by the roar of the water. The current was stronger than she had expected, and for a terrifying moment she thought they would be swept away. Then, suddenly, they were across. The horses found their footing on the far bank, scrambling up the muddy slope to solid ground. Bridget looked back to see Morrison and his men still on the other side, their horses refusing to enter the dangerous water. "This ain't over," Morrison shouted across the river. "I'll find you, Indian, and when I do, you'll hang for this." But his words were lost in the sound of the rushing water and the wind in the trees. For now, at least, they were safe. As they rode away from the river, Bridget felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had escaped their pursuers, but at what cost? They were now fugitives in a hostile land, with nowhere to go but forward. "What happens now?" she asked as they climbed a hill that would take them out of sight of the river. "Now we disappear," Dakota replied. "The land is vast, and there are places where even determined men cannot find us. But first we need to get as far from here as possible." As they rode into the gathering dusk, Bridget realized that her old life was truly over. There was no going back now, no safe harbor to return to. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with this man who had risked everything to give her a chance at freedom. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its ancient song. They were truly in the wilderness now, with only each other and the vast Dakota landscape for company. 3 days had passed since their desperate crossing of the Cheyenne River, and the landscape around them had transformed from the familiar hills of Dakota Territory into something altogether more alien and unforgiving. The Badlands stretched before them like the surface of another world, twisted rock formations, deep canyons carved by ancient waters, and an endless expanse of red and brown earth broken only by the occasional stunted tree or patch of hardy grass. Bridget pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a cold night. Their water supplies were running dangerously low, and the horses showed signs of exhaustion that even Dakota's expert care couldn't completely hide. "How much further to the next water?" she asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. Dakota studied the horizon, his dark eyes scanning the jagged landscape for familiar landmarks. "There should be a spring about 5 miles ahead, in a canyon my father showed me years ago, but..." He paused, uncertainty creasing his features. "But what? It has been dry this year. The spring may not be flowing." He dismounted and knelt beside a patch of cracked earth, running the dusty soil through his fingers. "This land is thirsty. It has been too long since the last good rain." They had been riding hard since dawn, pushing themselves and their horses to stay ahead of any pursuit. The river crossing had bought them time, but Dakota knew that Morrison wasn't the type to give up easily. Men like him saw any challenge to their authority as a personal affront that demanded retribution. As they made camp in the shelter of a red sandstone overhang, Bridget found herself studying her companion's face in the flickering light of their small fire. The past few days had changed him, she realized. The quiet confidence she had first noticed was still there, but it was now tempered with something harder, a wariness that spoke of a man who knew they were being hunted. "You're worried about something," she said, settling beside him on a blanket spread over the rocky ground. "Many things," he admitted, stirring the coals with a stick, "but mostly I'm thinking about tomorrow. We need supplies, food, water, ammunition, and there's a trading post about a day's ride from here. That's good news, isn't it? Perhaps. Or perhaps it's where our journey ends." He looked at her directly. "The trader there is a man named Caleb Morse. I've dealt with him before, and he's always been fair with me. But fairness and loyalty are different things, and there may be money involved now." Bridget felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "You think Morrison might have offered a reward?" "I would, if I were him. Money talks louder than friendship in this country, especially when times are hard." Dakota added another piece of dried wood to the fire. "But we don't have a choice. Without supplies, we'll die out here just as surely as if Morrison catches us." They ate their meager dinner in contemplative silence, the last of their jerky and some edible roots Dakota had found during the day. The portions were smaller than either of them would have liked, but they stretched what they had, knowing that tomorrow might bring either salvation or catastrophe. "Tell me about your father," Bridget said, seeking to distract herself from their dire situation. "You mentioned he showed you this country." A smile crossed Dakota's face, the first she had seen in days. "Chayton was a warrior and a storyteller. He could track a deer across solid rock and tell stories that would make you laugh or cry, or both. The smile faded. He died at Wounded Knee, trying to protect women and children who had already surrendered. I'm sorry, that must have been terrible for you. I was at the school when it happened. They didn't tell me for 3 months. When I finally learned the truth, I tried to run away, but they caught me. He touched his chest where she had noticed the scar. That's when they used the discipline rod on me. 20 lashes for trying to mourn my father. Bridget reached out instinctively, her hand covering his. No child should go through that, and no woman should be sold like cattle at an auction, he replied, his fingers briefly closing around hers. Perhaps that's why we understand each other. We've both learned that the world can be cruel to those who have no power. The moment of connection was interrupted by the distant sound of a coyote's howl, echoing across the Badlands like a ghost's lament. Both of them froze, listening intently, but no answering calls came. Just a coyote, Dakota said finally, but Bridget noticed he kept his rifle close as they settled down for the night. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the sun turning the red rocks into furnaces that radiated heat even in the early hours. They rode through increasingly desolate country, following what Dakota called an old buffalo trail that wound between towering stone formations and across flat expanses of baked earth. The trading post, when it finally appeared, was a welcome sight, a collection of low adobe buildings clustered around a central courtyard, with corrals for horses and a well that promised precious water. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys, and they could see figures moving in the shade of the covered porch. "Stay alert," Dakota murmured as they approached. "Something feels wrong." Bridget didn't have his experience reading the signs of danger, but even she could sense the tension in the air. The men on the porch watched them approach with too much interest, and she noticed that several of them had their hands resting casually on their weapons. Caleb Morse emerged from the main building as they dismounted, a thin, weathered man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of pale eyes that seemed to see everything. He had the look of someone who had spent his life on the frontier, adapting to whatever circumstances arose. Well, Thomas Sitting Bear," he said, using Dakota's English name. "Heard you might be coming this way." "Hello, Caleb. We need supplies. Food, water, ammunition if you have it." "Oh, I've got what you need, all right." Morse's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Question is, can you pay for it?" Dakota reached for his money pouch, but Morse held up a hand. "Before we talk business, maybe you'd like to meet some friends of mine. Just rode in this morning asking about you." Bridget's blood turned to ice as 3 familiar figures emerged from the shadows of the porch. Morrison, Sheriff Hartley, and a third man she didn't recognize, a rough-looking character with the kind of scars that spoke of a violent past. "Hello, Thomas," Morrison said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Miss O'Sullivan, you've led us quite a chase." "Caleb," Dakota said quietly, never taking his eyes off Morrison, "this is not your fight." "Afraid it is now," Morse replied, and Bridget could hear genuine regret in his voice. "Mr. Morrison here made me an offer I couldn't refuse, $500 for information leading to your capture. That's more money than I see in a good year." "You're making a mistake," Dakota said. "These men don't represent the law, they represent only themselves." "Maybe so," Morse agreed, "but their money spends just as good as anyone else's." Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Enough talk. You're both coming back with us. The woman's got a legal contract to fulfill, and you're going to hang for stealing her." "She's not property to be stolen," Dakota said, his voice steady despite the hopelessness of their situation. "That's where you're wrong, Savage. She's my property until her contract says otherwise." Morrison's eyes glittered with malice. "And you're going to learn what happens to Indians who steal from white men." Bridget felt her world tilting. After everything they had been through, after all the risks Dakota had taken to help her, they were trapped by simple greed. She thought of the rifle on Dakota's horse, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do them now. "There is another way," said a new voice from the courtyard entrance. Everyone turned to see an elderly Lakota man approaching, leaning heavily on a walking stick. He was dressed in traditional clothing, buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, and his long gray hair was braided with feathers and bone ornaments. Despite his age, his bearing commanded respect. "Grandfather," Dakota breathed, clearly recognizing the man. "Who the hell are you?" Morrison demanded. "I am Wikapi, elder of the Oglala Lakota, and I have come to offer you a choice, white man." The old man's English was careful but clear. "You may take these 2 back to your white man's law, or you may accept the justice of my people." "What kind of justice?" Sheriff Hartley asked, speaking for the first time. "Single combat. your best warrior against ours. Winner takes both the woman and the man." Waikapi's eyes were bright with intelligence. "It is an old way, but a fair one." Morrison laughed harshly. "You want me to risk everything on some savage ritual? You risk nothing. Your third man there has the look of a fighter. Surely he can defeat one Indian." The old man's voice carried a subtle challenge that made the scarred man straighten with interest. "What happens if we refuse?" Morrison asked. "Then you leave here with nothing. My grandson and the woman are under my protection now." Wikapi gestured toward the hills, and for the first time, Bridget noticed the glint of rifle barrels among the rocks. "And my protection has teeth." The standoff stretched for long moments, tension crackling in the desert air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Finally, Morrison turned to his scarred companion. "Briggs, you up for this?" The man called Briggs grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "Been a while since I had a good fight." "Yeah, I'm game." "Then it is settled," Wikapi announced. "Tomorrow at dawn, we will have our contest. Tonight, all are welcome to the hospitality of Caleb Morse's post. Tomorrow, we see what the spirits will decide." As the various parties settled in for an uneasy night, Bridget found herself caught between hope and despair. Tomorrow would determine not just her fate, but Dakota's as well. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrible thought whispered, what if this was all just another form of auction block, where her freedom would once again be decided by violence between men? The desert wind picked up as night fell, carrying with it the promise of a reckoning that would change everything. The first light of dawn painted the Badlands in shades of gold and crimson as two circles formed in the dusty courtyard of Morse's trading post. Bridget stood with Wikapi and several other Lakota warriors who had emerged from the hills like spirits materializing from the earth itself. Across from them, Morrison, Sheriff Hartley, and Morse watched with varying degrees of anticipation and unease. In the center of the larger circle, Dakota and Briggs faced each other, stripped to the waist, each holding a knife. The rules were simple. First blood would determine the winner, and with it Bridget's fate. "You sure about this, Indian?" Briggs sneered, rolling his massive shoulders. Scars crisscrossed his torso, testament to a lifetime of violence. "I've killed better men than you with my bare hands." Dakota said nothing, his dark eyes focused and calm. Bridget could see the tension in his muscles, but his face showed no fear, only the quiet determination she had come to admire. "Begin," Wikapi commanded. Briggs attacked immediately, lunging forward with surprising speed for such a large man. But Dakota moved like water, sliding aside and letting his opponent's momentum carry him past. The clash of steel rang out as their knives met, sparks flying in the morning light. For several minutes they circled each other, testing defenses, looking for openings. Briggs relied on brute strength and experience, while Dakota used speed and precision, dancing away from the heavier man's powerful strikes. The turning point came when Briggs, growing frustrated, made a wild swing that left him off balance. Dakota stepped inside his guard, and his knife flashed once. A thin line of red appeared across Briggs's shoulder. "First blood," Wikapi announced. "The spirits have spoken." Morrison's face turned purple with rage. "This is ridiculous. I'm not bound by some savage ritual." "You gave your word," the elder replied calmly. "Will you show us that a white man's honor is worth nothing?" Sheriff Hartley placed a restraining hand on Morrison's arm. "It's over, Jake. We agreed to this." For a moment, Bridget thought Morrison might draw his gun anyway, but the sight of the Lakota warriors emerging from concealment among the rocks seemed to cool his anger. He was outnumbered and outgunned. "This isn't finished," he spat, but he was already backing toward his horse. As Morrison and his men rode away into the rising sun, Bridget felt as if she could breathe freely for the first time in months. The weight that had pressed on her chest since that terrible day on the auction block was finally lifting. "What happens now?" she asked Wikapi. The old man smiled and pulled out a familiar document, her indenture contract. With deliberate ceremony, he tore it into pieces and let the fragments scatter on the desert wind. "Now you are free, as you were always meant to be," he said simply. Dakota approached, pulling his shirt back on. "Grandfather, how did you know to find us?" "The spirits whisper to those who know how to listen," Wikapi replied with a mysterious smile. "And perhaps a certain trader sent word that you might need help." Morse stepped forward, looking sheepish. "Couldn't go through with it after all. Sent a message to the reservation 2 days ago. The money ain't worth a man's soul." 3 months later, Bridget stood on a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. She had found her cousin in Sacramento, a kind man who welcomed her with open arms and helped her start a new life. Dakota had chosen to stay in California as well, finding work as a guide for settlers who needed someone who understood both the land and its people. They had built a small cabin in the foothills, where they could see both the ocean and the mountains. "No regrets?" he asked, joining her on the hillside. Bridget smiled, her hand finding his. "How can I regret the path that led me to freedom? To you?" As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they knew that their story was just beginning. They had found something rare in the harsh frontier world, not just love, but the courage to choose their own destiny.